views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Good evening and welcome to Bronxtalk. Tonight we begin a weekly series of political debates in the upcoming September 9th state primaries. Our plan is to hold forums for the 78th Assembly District next Monday night with incumbent Jose Rivera and challenger Fernando Tirado. Then on the 25th it will be the 34th Senatorial District with incumbent Senator Jeff Klein and challenger Oliver Capel. But tonight we stop at the 33rd Senatorial District, which includes the Bronx neighborhoods of Kingsbridge, Bedford Park, Fordham, University Heights, and Belmont. The incumbent is Gustavo Rivera. The challenger is Councilman Fernando Cabrera. Quite unfortunately, Mr. Cabrera declined our invitation to participate in tonight's program and offered no explanation as to why. As we have said numerous times before, this is a posture that we neither appreciate nor accept. If a candidate seeks to represent the people of the Bronx, we steadfastly believe it is that candidate's responsibility to participate in every possible opportunity to present their platform and candidacy to the people of the Bronx. In this case, Mr. Cabrera offered no explanation as to why he declined to be here. Inexcusable is a word that I've used before in these cases, and it comes to mind again tonight. As we have done in other debates that we've held over the past 20 years, Mr. Cabrera will be represented on our set tonight by an empty chair. As is our policy during political debates, we won't take phone calls tonight, but you can email questions or comments to us at bronxtalk@bronxnet.org or post them on our Facebook page, and we'll read them on the air during a future edition of our program. So in our studio tonight, running for re-election in the Democratic primary for the 33rd Senatorial District, it is Senator Gustavo Rivera. Sir, welcome back to Bronxtalk.
It is a pleasure to be here, and I should mention that you forgot Morris Park and Van Nest, as well as a little sliver of Parkchester and the zoo. I consider the zoo one of the neighborhoods that I represent.
Well, happily, I'm not running for office, so all those neighborhoods, they can be as annoyed at me as they want, but you have some stake in it, so there it is. Before we really get into you and your candidacy, a statement on the fact that you have an empty chair next to you.
You know, I think it's, Gary, I think it's disrespectful when you have someone who is, 4 years ago, I was sitting, I sat on this stage with another one of another person who was running in that election, and then another empty chair.
That's right. That was at that time the incumbent Senator Espada.
Yes, and also another challenger was here, and we were both here because we both believed that it was important to come and make the case of why we believe that we needed to be representing the 33rd District. I believe that in the last 4 years, my main goal has really been about to reestablish the trust of the people in the 33rd District in government. I believe that I have done that, and as the council member believes that I have not done that apparently, and he wants to challenge me. I would have loved to have a conversation with him today about why that is, and I would have loved for him to have an opportunity to make his case to you and to your viewers and to Bronxites to why he needs to be in the state Senate and not me. Unfortunately, that's not going to be the case tonight, and ultimately I think it's disrespectful both to you and to Bronxites that deserve to have this conversation happen.
You brought his petitions to court, and apparently there will be a ruling, as I understand, on Wednesday. He's not here to defend himself, but the question needs to be asked. How is this going to go? Do you believe sincerely that there were egregious violations in the petitioning process?
I do, and that's what we have argued in court. We have found a number of people that I think in the number of 5 or 6 people that are deceased. We've entered some of their death certificates into the record, and their signatures magically appear in the petitions. We actually had 5 people on the stand also testify that their signatures were on the petitions when they did not sign them themselves. ultimately, I believe that what this demonstrates is that he does not have the support of Bronxites, or certainly not folks in my district, to actually be on the ballot. So we expect for a decision to come before the end of the week, and we'll see what happens by that time.
Maybe the biggest project in the Bronx, or certainly in this district, is the one going on right down the block at the Kingsbridge Armory. Presumably you're thrilled about what the plans are. He was accused of trying to route community benefits money to a group that he was connected with, Community Action Unlimited. He's never really answered questions about it. The matter seems to essentially have been dropped. Should there be any further action, or at this point it's for people, pundits and others, to have dialogue about it?
Well, first of all, I think that the Kingsbridge Armory and the Kingsbridge National Ice Center, which is what the borough president, through his leadership, and certainly I was also involved in making sure that this project happened, and we cannot forget to mention the community groups led by CARA, the Kingsbridge Armory Redevelopment Alliance, were very much involved in bringing this project to this district and to this neighborhood, because we believe that ultimately it's going to have an incredibly positive impact in the Bronx. And we work really hard to make sure that it happens. As you pointed out, there was an extensive story in the New York Times just a few months ago that detailed extensively all of the allegations about acts that while in office, the council member, things that he did which were very inappropriate. And I would love to see what he has to say about some of this, but ultimately, what is positive is that the project is going forward, even though he apparently, with his actions, tried to deprive it from the community.
Is there anything further in this other than the dialogue that you've had? Free to talk about it, but in other words, should other action be taken, or at this point we now move on?
Well, I think the important part now is there's actually something that we started to see just a couple of weeks ago. There was a concern with some of the business owners along the Kingsbridge Armory corridor on Kingsbridge Avenue. That were concerned because there was a landlord who was potentially going to raise their rents. As this project comes into fruition, there's going to be changes that happen in the community, and we want to make sure that as these changes happen, they are inclusive to the communities that are here, both the businesses and the folks that live here. So what I'm going to be concerned about is making sure that as we help those businesses push back on that landlord and say, let's negotiate in good faith, and ultimately the landlord did step back and now is negotiating with them in good faith about new leases for their businesses. That is the type of work that we need to be doing to make sure that these businesses stay here. And the same thing as it relates to people living in these neighborhoods, we want to make sure that as these changes happen, they're inclusive of the folks that already live here.
This cuts to the core of, I think, a very important dialogue in the Bronx right now, and that is the notion of gentrification. Every one of us wants to see some neighborhoods, all neighborhoods really in the Bronx, do better. But the fear, and in many cases a real fear, is that if they do better and we put up better housing, all of a sudden the rents are too high, and so the people who have lived in those neighborhoods for many years can't live there. And as we saw, so far the line has been held on some of that. Commercial rents go way up because everybody says now the property is worth more, and those people get out, or eventually eliminated. How do you keep those rents down? The market is a free market. Logic would dictate if property values rise, rents are going to go up, and unfortunately the people on the lower end don't get to stay.
The way that we fight that back is by remaining together, unified as a community. When these business owners came to the community board and brought a couple of elected officials, myself included, into the room to talk about what had happened to them individually, when the landlord had called them, some of them had received letters saying that from 1 month to the next they would have their rents doubled, we got together as a group and we said, as a collective.
Who's the we?
The we mean the Kingsbridge neighborhood. The
CARA,
the Merchants Association, the Merchants Association,
Kingsbridge Road Merchants
yes,
Association.
the Kingsbridge Road Merchants Association, the community board, along with some elected officials, myself included.
Was the councilman there as well?
The council member's chief of staff was there.
Okay.
So ultimately, what we did was we said, as a group, as a collective, we're going to say to the landlord, we know that this is your property, but we want to make sure that the changes that happened here are inclusive of the folks that are already here. And the changes that are going to happen, some businesses are going to stay, some of them are going to leave, but we want to make sure that they're not pushed out. Because as the development happens, it'll still take a few years before the armory is up and running. We do not want to have an empty commercial corridor while that happens. So the way that we fight back at all of these things is staying united as a community, certainly the Kingsbridge Armory Redevelopment Alliance, as well as the Merchants Association and other community groups, we want to make sure that we collectively stay as one group so that we can push back on these changes as they start to happen.
Along with developing the community and developing the neighborhood better, in a more fruitful way. I'm assuming you're not saying, well, let's hold the line on some of the properties that
what I'm saying
are
is
not helpful to the community.
Correct. What I'm saying is, much like the process where one of the reasons I was very supportive of the Kingsbridge National Ice Center was because the developers came in good faith, sat around a table with community groups, and said, we want to be here, but only if you want us here. So the community benefits agreement that was negotiated was unprecedented. And I'm sure that you've had folks in this show talking about it before. We're talking about local hiring, every job more than living wage, 50,000 square feet of community space, etc. These were things that were achieved at that negotiating table. That is what we want to do. Demonstrate strength as a community so that when we have changes that are happening, that they happen on our terms, and that it is an inclusive conversation.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about some larger political issues. The Independent Democratic Conference, which you have said on this show in the past and elsewhere that you oppose. If the IDC now sits with the Democrats and gives your party the majority that you think it deserves, problem solved?
Well, I think that, first of all, I have said for years on the record, certainly on this show, that my issue was that I believe that we as a Democratic conference would be more effective as a unified Democratic conference. 2 years ago, when we had enough seats, the Democrats had enough seats to be a majority in the state Senate. Unfortunately, there was a Republican-led coalition that was brought together with the IDC. I do believe that we are just on the brink of having a Democratic-led coalition in January. There are many things that can happen between now and then, but I take the IDC members, including Senator Jeff Klein, at his word that we are going to work together to get to.
So
to make
is
sure that
this
we're there.
problem solved? And now you're like, well, I'm okay with where we are at right now.
Well, my focus right now is obviously on my primary. And once that primary is done, that I'm going to focus on getting more Democrats elected to the Senate, making sure that we keep the Democrats that we have, including a couple in the Hudson Valley like C.C. Katchik or Terry Gibson or Ted O'Brien. We want to make sure that we keep those Democrats and we add more of them. So I'm going to hopefully spend a lot of time making sure that we flip Republican seats to Democratic hands.
If they sit with Democrats, and there are some who may be conservative on certain issues like Senator Diaz in the Bronx, would you say, you know what, if he has his own point of view, the Democratic Party is broad enough to include a wide range of points of view, and this is a good way to house those people who may not sit with us on certain issues, but they're Democrats, but it kind of broadens our whole spectrum in the Democratic Party. Do you like that?
Sometimes I do shows news shows that are broadcast to upstate residents. And when the argument is made to me in those shows that some people argue that the Democrats should not be in the majority because they are led by this whole bunch of city folk and they don't know anything about the rest of upstate, my response is always, let's get more Democrats elected in those places of the state that we don't have Democrats. Since we have Terry Gibson, C.C. Katchik, and Ted O'Brien in the Hudson Valley and in Rochester, we have Tim Kennedy up in Buffalo, I believe that we are a better conference because of their participation. I want more Democrats all across the state. And I'm certainly not going to agree with them on everything. And if we have somebody who is from a suburban or from a rural district, they're certainly going to have different views on a lot of issues that I do. But we are a better Democratic conference because
So you haven't really talked about the fact that it certainly appears there will be an IDC on the Democratic side. It means more Democrats. It sounds like you don't really have an opinion on it. At least you haven't directly said you like the idea or don't like the idea.
Well, what I will say is the following. We need to be to make sure that we get things done in the Senate, we need to have a Democratic-led coalition. And I've always said, as an example, I'm the ranking member in the Health Committee in the Senate. We get to a majority in January, I will be the chair of the Health Committee in the Senate. There's never been a Bronxite or a person of color that has led that committee. And in a budget where we have a $143 billion budget this year, $66 billion of it was Medicaid, and $4.5 billion of it was public health money. So we're talking almost half the total state budget is related to health. Me being the chair of the health committee means I get to participate directly in the negotiations of how that money gets allocated, which means that there will be a positive impact in the Bronx, I believe, and certainly my participation. And I will not be the only one. Ruth Hassel Thompson, the chair of the Judiciary Committee. Jose Marcos Serrano, the chair of the Parks and Recreations Committee. Adriano Espaillat, the chair of the Housing Committee. And all of this is to say that that is what we've always wanted. A Democratic-led majority will make sure that we have chair people in all these committees and therefore lead the conversation across the state on all those issues.
Regardless if the IDC still exists. I'm going to add a coda to what you said.
If they are with us and we form a coalition with the Independent Democratic Conference, we are still a Democratic-led coalition.
At this point, are you enthusiastic about the candidacy of Oliver Capel? You had come out originally when before the talk of the IDC joining the Democrats. Where do you stand on that?
I've maintained my endorsement of Oliver Capel.
Enthusiastically, or I said it, I don't want to back off.
Certainly, he's somebody who has been a very good friend. He was one of the first supporters that I had, and I endorsed him at one point before all these conversations happened, and I keep my word. So I'm certainly going to be maintaining that. But I am focused on my race.
Part of the dialogue in this campaign is about the nature of the constituency of the 33rd Senatorial District when it comes to key moral issues like gay marriage and women's rights, as well as prayer in schools, which Kate Pastor reported in a very interesting profile of Councilman Cabrera in City Limits. You have said, and you were quoted in that article as saying you think this district, which includes many churches and people from traditional backgrounds, is much more progressive. What gives you that idea?
I talk to my neighbors every single day. It gives me, it's not an idea. I think it's factual. I think when I walk around the district and I talk about whether it's, you know how many gay couples live in the Bronx? You know how many gay couples I bump into all the time in my neighborhood, right here, around Lehman College and in other parts of the Bronx. When it comes to issues of progressive democratic issues, we have moved in a positive way. We have moved to be more inclusive of people's rights. This is why marriage equality was such an important issue that we needed to make sure that we voted on, and I proudly voted for it. Also, as it refers to women's right to choose, a woman's right to choose to make her own health care choices. It is incredibly important that we maintain that, and I think that women in the Bronx also will agree with me that we need to protect that, as New York, actually before Roe v. Wade, protected the rights of women to be able to choose to have an abortion or not. So I think that on these issues, I'm not saying that there are not social conservatives in my district, but with those folks, I will agree on many economic issues and disagree on social ones. But I believe that as a total package, when I talk with my neighbors, it is very clear to me that this is quite a progressive district on all those issues, and I'm proud to stand on my record on the record of what I've done in the Senate regarding those issues.
What are the chances of getting ethics reform in the state of New York?
It has been a tough haul. I remember one of the first bills that I introduced had to do with full disclosure of outside income. I've made the case on this show, as well as other places, that people need to know that we as elected officials and as public servants work for them and don't work for other folks. So full disclosure of outside income is something that was partly included in one of the governor's first ethics packages all the way back in 2011. But I think that there's still a lot of work to do to change the way that Albany works. And I stand, one of the issues that I think is the most important is campaign finance reform. It is a little obscene to me that we can have, that you as an individual could give somebody running for president about $2,700 or $2,500, while you could give me in the neighborhood of $17,000 in an electoral cycle. It's a little absurd. And when you're talking about somebody running, let's say that you had companies, you had LLCs that you were part owner in, you could actually give me a check from each one of those that would amount to $17,000. This system needs to be changed, and ultimately we need to take these special interests out of politics. Having a campaign finance system like the one that we have in the city would be incredibly important, and I'm going to work this session to make sure that it happens.
What about the bill to stop elected officials from using campaign funds for legal defense, and are you comfortable with the governor going that route?
I'm supportive of the bill. It's not one of the only things. There's a lot of things that I think we should not be able to do with campaign funds. Campaign funds are for campaign purposes. We should not use them for other purposes. It is unfortunate that this is the way that the governor has chosen to go. I am not supportive of his actions, but I'm supportive of the bill. Currently, he's not breaking the law.
Your own filings show that you had used some campaign funds for a storage facility and things like that. Does that contradict with what your philosophical statement was?
Not at all. If you go to my storage facility, and I'll be more than happy to take you, we have campaign-related stuff there that I don't want to keep in my home. We have desks and filing cabinets and paper. I mean, you know how much paper we buy to print up lists and such, and then we don't use it. We need somewhere to store it. So I am comfortable with all the expenses that I made. And by the way, I am always on time when it comes to my campaign expenditures to make sure that I do all the filings correctly, which is unfortunately something that cannot be said about my opponent.
Let's talk education. Are you in favor of the state education department's Common Core standards?
I think it's a complicated matter, but I'm not a fan of Common Core. I believe that the way that it has been implemented has really just reiterated this culture of just teaching to a test, to not only judge teachers based on the results of the test. And let me back up for a second. It's not that I don't believe in standards, but I am not sure if the Common Core is the best way to do it. I think that we have to rethink this whole thing. And unfortunately, the results that have happened across the state tell us that this is a system that needs to be rethought.
How do you see that happening, or do you see that happening? Presumably you'll support Governor Cuomo for his re-election. Frankly, Rob Astorino has said, well, I've come out against Common Core standards. On that, you may not agree with him on other issues. On that issue, it sounds like you're in agreement with the Republican side. How would education reform actually happen in the state of New York, certainly if the governor has his heels dug in about Common Core?
Well, first of all, I believe that I can disagree with someone and still be supportive of them generally. The president is a perfect example. Many things that he has done, maybe regarding immigration, for example, are actions that I don't agree with, but I can still be supportive of the governor. I'm supportive of the president. And in the case of the governor, this is something that I disagree with him on, but I can still be supportive of him. I think that one of the first things that we need to talk about as far as education reform has to do with the Campaign for Fiscal Equity. Years ago, as I'm sure that you are familiar, we brought a lawsuit. A lawsuit was brought against the state of New York saying that kids in the 5 boroughs had been shortchanged for years. And ultimately a judge found that was the case, that the state had not made good on its promise to provide a sound basic education to kids all over the state. And unfortunately, we have not made good on that promise. So we have to go back, and hopefully during the process of negotiation of the budget next year, we can have a real conversation about starting to pay down that debt. So I think that that's a very important part of the conversation. And look, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have standards, but I do think that we need to rethink the way that these standards are set up, because to teach to a test ultimately I don't think leads to a better education system and does not lead to students learning better.
When we did the debate and the part of the campaign, which we covered extensively on this program, that ultimately led to Charlie Rangel becoming elected, one of the dialogues that came out was bringing tech jobs, technology jobs. And frankly, I was disappointed because I heard them talking about them bringing it to Upper Manhattan. So the question would be, if that's an important agenda and an important way to grow the economy, to give Bronxites opportunity, how can you bring tech jobs to the Bronx? Can you bring them to the Bronx? And do you see them really as a way of improving quality of life in the borough of the Bronx and in your district, of course?
My district, unfortunately, has an unemployment rate that hovers around 13%. And the median income is about $25,000 a year. So therefore, we have a district that certainly needs economic development and job creation. And tech jobs, we absolutely need to have a conversation about bringing tech jobs to the Bronx and certainly to my district. I would say that part of that, I am limited in what I can do as a state senator. I can certainly, working along with our borough president and working along with the governor, preferably in a majority position, as a majority member, working along with the governor and by the way, the lieutenant governor candidate, Kathy Hochul, has said that she's going to definitely make it a priority of hers to bring economic development, much like Lieutenant Governor Duffy made that a big part of his role as lieutenant governor.
What I'm really asking
Yes.
is, how do you put the Bronx on the table? Because everybody's going to talk about jobs and tech jobs, but every time I hear that dialogue, like I heard it when we did the Charlie Rangel and Adriano Espaillat debate, I heard them talking about other places. So I guess, how do we get the Bronx on the table?
I think being a majority member is part of it, in all honesty. As I said earlier, the budget of the state of New York this year, that we voted on earlier this year, was $143 billion. When we don't have majority members in that conversation, then the Bronx gets shortchanged. Having majority members in that conversation means that we get to determine the overall direction of this whole budget. And it's not that everything is going to wind up here, but certainly a lot more than we've had so far.
Only have a couple of seconds. What's the most important piece of legislation you'd like to see that we haven't asked you about? Real quick.
New York is Home, which is one that I introduced.
New York is
Home,
which means?
Which I introduced very near the end of the session. It says that if you are, regardless of your immigration status, if you're a resident of the state of New York for 3 consecutive years, pay state taxes for 3 consecutive years, prove your identity and say that you're going to serve on jury duty, you would be granted citizenship of the state of New York. And we can have a long conversation about that another time.
And it's got to be another time. Senator Gustavo Rivera, thank you so much. Good luck the rest of the campaign. And I know you agree with me when I say to Bronxites, whoever you vote for, you got to come out and vote.
Absolutely.
It's the only way we can show strength in our borough, and that'll be September 9th in the primary. Appreciate your time. Folks, we always ask viewers to submit viewer mail. And so we received a couple of comments on our Facebook page about the show we did last week about the Grand Concourse. So this came from Christina L. via Facebook. Please let the Bronx have some wonderful streets. Geez, so many places in the world. There's great boulevards to walk or drive on, but in New York, especially in the Bronx, we can't have it. Thank you to Christina. And this came from Alex B. via Facebook. In the long term, car culture will be diminishing over time, and bike culture can be cultivated in a way that coexists and becomes a wonderful benefit. More oversight on bicyclists seems rather exaggerated and a waste of resources that can be used to make sure current regulations are being followed and education for behavioral change. Thanks to Alex B. and Christina. And if you have questions or comments on anything you heard on tonight's show or anything going on in the Bronx, then email them to us at bronxtalk@bronxnet.org. You can post them on our Facebook page. And as you can see, we'll read them on the air during a future edition of our program. You can become a fan of Bronx Talk on Facebook, and you can look at our archives at bronxnet.org and check out the Bronx Talk link on the bottom right navigation bar. Next week, as we mentioned earlier, we'll present the second in a series of debates, this time for the 78th Assembly District. Both Jose Rivera and Fernando Tirado have been invited. And then the week after, on August 25th, the race in the 34th Senatorial District. Jeff Klein and Oliver Capel will square off on our program. Thanks to our producer, Dalia Gonzalez, and director, Shirley Arrieta. We'll see you next week. Good night.
Kids will spend 15 minutes watching online videos like this one.
Brushing for 2 minutes now can save your child from severe tooth pain.